Hello, and welcome to A Glorious Mystery, Growing Up Spiritually. I'm John Cavanaugh from the UNC Newman Center, and I'm so glad you were able to come back for part two of our series of 3 talks. Part two is entitled How We Think and Tell Our Story. And today we'll focus on how our thinking and how we solve problems, how we approach issues changes across adulthood, and how we tell the story of ourselves, our autobiographies, also change, and how those issues evolve and change as we grow older. So happy you're here. I'm going to switch over to share screen and we'll get started. So if you remember at the end of part one, I asked you to think about times when you were nagged about something or you had doubts about something. And you'll remember from part one that nagging and doubt are the drivers of change across adulthood. So think about that homework. Think about those times, those moments of change that you experienced, the new perspectives that perhaps you got as a result. And maybe you even had the experience of thinking, well, that's how I was then. This is how I am now. Think a minute about what characterized those changes and how is it that you think differently and are different. Those are the issues that we're going to be focusing on today. Our thought and our being has changed. So today, we're going to do a quick recap of part one, and then we're going to go deep into cognitive development across adulthood. That's the way we think and so on. And we're also going to go deep into how we tell our stories, how we present our autobiography to other people, how we answer the question, tell me a little bit about yourself. Then we're going to combine the changes in thinking with our changes in feeling and life stories to get a much more complete picture about how we continue to grow across adulthood. We'll put those threads together to form that tapestry. And finally, we'll take a preview at part three, where we will focus very specifically on our faith journey and look at how various people have characterized that growth that happens to us across adulthood, how we think about God differently, how we read the scriptures differently, how our values change over time. So let's dive in. Previously, in A Glorious Mystery, we talked about the fact that change across adulthood actually does happen. If you remember, the view of adulthood up until about the mid-20th century was it was all downhill after you reached young adulthood. Not anymore. We have a much different understanding and a much different appreciation for the changes that do occur. We thought about and considered how we deal with issues or problems, or if you remember that list of the big questions about yourself, what's the meaning of my life? What am I doing with myself? What matters to me? And so on. Those can provide insight because our answers change over time. As we mentioned earlier, nagging and doubt are the telltale signs that something's going on. Something is changing. There's a force within us that says the old way isn't enough. Remember, we considered Paul's letter to the Corinthians, where he in fact says, when I was a child, I did things as a child. But once I became an adult, I put away the childish way of doing things and started doing them in an adult way. Nagging and doubt are the telltale signs and the motivations. We talked about genetics and how our genes lay down the foundation for change and development, but genes are not our destiny. Foundation, yes. Absolute determinative outcome, no, because our environment, our experiences, our lifestyle, and so on can affect how those genes play out. We also understood that certain genes act as clocks, turn things on, turn things off. And we ended the part one considering the changes in the interconnections in our brain, especially in that part of the brain right behind the forehead, the prefrontal cortex, with a part that's deep in the middle, the amygdala. The prefrontal cortex having to do with very high level thinking, advanced problem solving, and the like, and the amygdala, our emotion center. And that only in adulthood are those parts of the brain significantly connected, and in the case of the prefrontal cortex, really operational much at all. So let's pick up where we left off. Remember, our brains are wired for efficiency. We don't think consciously about everything all the time. Our brains are organized and programmed to make thinking as easy as possible. We don't want to exert a lot of effort when we think all the time. And in order to do that, the wiring in the brain creates what are called heuristics and biases. We mentioned that last time, but now we're going to take a much closer look at it. Heuristics and biases in our thinking have a number of very important characteristics. They involve selective perception. That means that things can go on in the environment and we never see them. We don't hear them. We don't sense them because that's not what we're paying attention to. We've learned from experience that certain things really matter. You need to really hone in on it. Other things, not so much. Heuristics and biases also involve incoming information. If incoming information attaches or supports what we already know, then we judge that information favorably. We trust it more. If it doesn't, if it goes counter to what we already know, we're highly likely to just automatically reject it without another thought. That creates what we call the illusion of understanding. So we think that we understand and know a whole lot more about an issue or a topic than we actually do. So if somebody asks you, well, proof that what you say is true, we'd be hard pressed to do that. But our feeling, our sense is that we are experts in it. We've read a lot, and by golly, we really have that down. Our selective perception leads to what's called blind spot unawareness. Every one of us has blind spots. Very few of us are aware of exactly how those blind spots work and where they are in our thinking. We act as if we don't have them. Confirmation bias has to do with the fact that when people say things that line up with what we believe that they have the truth. Information that agrees with us, we're likely to hang on to. And we put more stock in information that agrees with our position than we do with information that does not. We're likely to think that's myth, that's alternative facts. It just can't be true. Those start combining into a process in which you start to believe that your position is the right position. And your position, which is not mine, your position is the source of bias and untruth. I have the truth, and if you disagree with me, you don't. What's called naive realism is that we tend to think that things that agree with us are true, and we just take for granted that the world works in a particular way. And we're driven to what's called motivated skepticism when we have this rejection of other people's points of view. We're skeptical of other people who don't agree with us. We tend to like people who do. And finally, we are deeply unaware of our own knowledge and competence gaps. We are far from experts in everything, but we act as if we are. We believe that we're far more competent than we are. So if you ask someone to rate their level of skill, for example, if this isn't an area where they think they know a lot, they're highly likely to overrate themselves and to be overconfident. This opens one up, as we'll see, to mistakes, errors of omission, because we just didn't pay attention. So the takeaway from this discussion is that heuristics and biases are incredibly powerful, and everyone has them and uses them. We may not have the same ones, but we have ours. And they really do drive what information we pay attention to, what we take in, how strongly we adopt a position, and how likely or unlikely it will be that we could possibly change our minds. So let's take it up a notch and talk a bit about what happens in cognitive development in adulthood. Thousands of studies over the last 60 years have documented that there are some fundamental shifts in how we think across adulthood. These changes do, in fact, reflect the underlying development in the brain that we talked about in part one, those interconnections, those parts of the brain that really come into play during adulthood. And these changes involve with how we deal with complexity, how many things can we keep in mind at the same time, ambiguity, when there's no clear answer, things are not fuzzy, concepts are ill-defined, and so on, and how we deal with contradiction and paradox. How easily can we hold two opposing views in our head at the same time and deal with them independently and in interaction with each other? How deeply can we understand a parable, for example, which has paradox embedded in it? Can we only get it at a superficial level, or do we really understand the deep meaning of it? So what we have here at the bottom of the slide is the result of these thousands of studies that have looked at the changes in thinking across adulthood. And in general, researchers pretty much agree that there are three basic levels or stages of thinking across adulthood. The first, and by the way, any of these can carry you through for the rest of your life. It's not necessary that you progress or move from one stage to the other. So I wanted to make that clear. The first that we'll consider is what's called absolutist thinking. And we'll talk about what the deeper characteristics are of each. But in general, absolutist thinking is a position that you're right, your information is true. You accept that information from trusted others, trusted authorities, and it's very difficult to change people's minds who adopt that level, that kind of thinking. Second stage is almost the opposite of that. You go from one and only one right way of thinking, one right answer, to untold numbers of possibilities in what's called relativistic uncertainty. You get the idea and understanding that there's more than one way to solve this problem. There's more than one right answer to this question. There's more than one right view on this particular issue. I see the point in multiple perspectives here. The issue in relativistic uncertainty is that that's as far as you take it. You have a great deal of difficulty seeing the relative merits of one answer or another. You tend to look at it as, there's a lot of right answers, and who's to say who's right? Who's to say what the truth is? I'm okay You're entitled to your opinion, I'm entitled to mine, and that's all we need to agree on right now. Out of relativistic uncertainty, when the nagging and doubt seeps in again, that's okay, but I need to make a decision on certain values or principles that I need to run my life. The next stage is what's called principled certainty. We take those various positions that we're able to generate in relativistic uncertainty and say, they're not all created equal. Certain ones actually work better in certain circumstances, and I'm going to use them on a regular basis. I'm going to use and choose those values as the ones that are going to drive my life. So these three stages, absolutist, relativistic uncertainty, and principled certainty, describe the trajectory of thinking that we'll experience across adulthood. And again, one can be an absolutist thinker all the way through adulthood and never really enter into relativistic uncertainty. One other thing, the more you shift to the right in these modes of thinking, the more effort and work it takes. Remember, our brains are wired for efficiency. So no one operates at the highest level that they're capable of doing all the time. We have a default mode when we don't need to really work hard. And when we want to, when the issue demands it, and we're capable of that level of thinking, then and only then are we going to use the highest level that we're capable of. So let's take a closer look at each of these stages. In absolutist thinking, knowledge is gained through the word of an authority figure or through firsthand observation, not through an evaluation of evidence. What does that mean? That means that you're going to trust people that you believe are authorities on this particular topic. Who are they? Those could be influencers on social media. Those could be popular culture figures. Those could be commentators on particular networks. Those could be particular newspapers or magazines. Those could be particular adults or other people in your life. It's anyone or any source that you believe has the actual truth. You will then believe them essentially in anything. And as long as the information is coming from that authoritative source, you will trust it. Another way to gain that insight is through your own observation, through your own experience. Well, my experience says that such and such is true. My experience says that the sky is blue, okay? Even if everybody else says, no, the sky is green, you will reject that because that is not your lived experience. The key here is that through either channel, either through the authority figure or through your own firsthand observation, data, evidence, science, from any other source of evidence or experimentation is not the source of truth for an absolutist thinker. So all of the evidence in the world presented to that person is not likely to have any effect whatsoever unless it comes from that trusted authority figure or their own experience. That's very important, and we'll come back to that later. People believe, who are absolutist thinkers, that what they know is absolutely correct and that they know with absolute certainty. These are not people who question their knowledge base. This is not a style of thinking that leads you to suspect that something might not be right here. You have no doubt. Your position is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. It is correct. Any other position on an issue out there is wrong. Moreover, there's a tendency to start ascribing other characteristics to people who do not agree with you or who hold other positions. That not only they're wrong, but they could have other undesirable characteristics. So absolutist is a great label for this style of thinking. You know it absolutely. As long as the information that you have came from that trusted authority or your own experience, you are good to go. Sometimes, though, things happen. And what happens if your experience, for example, indicates that maybe what you thought you knew isn't working, isn't so true anymore? Or you applied that knowledge and it didn't work out for you. So then doubt starts to creep in and you become aware of other positions. You stick a toe into the next stage of thinking, relativistic uncertainty. And in relativistic uncertainty, knowledge, or at this stage, more accurately termed knowledge claims, are relative, and that all theories and positions are equally correct. And in this sense, there is no way to know anything for certain. So as I mentioned earlier, it's almost the exact opposite of absolutist thinking, right? There are lots of positions on everything. There's more than one way to solve the problem. There are many facets to a set of issues. There are many types of belief systems. And you know what? Who am I to judge? I don't have the right to do that. I have no right to impose my thinking on you. I have no right really to argue with your right to hold that position, because if I have a right to do it, so do you. And it's the individual's right that is sacred. The fact that there's no way to know anything for certain means that everything is uncertain. We never really know when we're on the right path. We just have to keep collecting more and more and more information. Data are trusted. It's just that you need to build a case. If you can build a case, that might, in fact, create yet another potential position on the issue. The relativism here is that sometimes what's considered the right answer at this stage of thinking depends on the situation. In one setting, this is the right thing to do. In another setting, maybe not. A different way of acting. This is where we get into subjective values, relativistic values, where or principles of how to live your life vary from situation to situation. So there's nothing that applies across the board. Sometimes a little while later, that becomes just frustrating because you reach a point in your life when you want to put your money down and make a decision on an issue and use it in more than one situation. That becomes the transition to the third stage called principled certainty. And people who think at the level of principled certainty construct knowledge based on the evaluation of available data. This is really an analytical, very high level, complex way of thinking. They gather as much information from as many different points of view as possible. They go into that analysis, treating all possibilities as equal, and then see where the best solution sits. These people are sure of what they know, But in the face of new evidence, they're willing to reevaluate it. They're willing to change their mind if the evidence has changed or a better position better aligns with the data. They accept certain truths that hold across situations based on that evaluation of evidence. So something like the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself holds across situations. We use that as a guide, and it doesn't matter what the situation is. This is a level of thinking that can handle paradox and ambiguity. People who are at the principled certainty level are very comfortable in highly ambiguous situations where nothing is clear. You're not even sure maybe what all of the variables that are in the situation or all the issues that need to be considered. You may not even know what those are. You may not even have anybody you can ask. You can also handle contradiction and be comfortable in that contradiction. We're gonna see and take up in part 3, for example, that some of Jesus' sayings, like love your enemies, the first shall be last, those kinds of paradoxes are very difficult to understand at levels other than principled certainty because of the impossibility of holding those paradoxes in mind. So those are the deeper characteristics that describe the 3 major stages or levels of thinking across adulthood. Now let's take it a little bit more in practice at the day-to-day level. As I mentioned earlier, not everyone goes through every stage. There's no necessary requirement for that. And as I mentioned, each subsequent stage involves more and more cognitive effort. You can see how the principled certainty stage, because you're analyzing all possible angles that you can think of and holding all that information at your head at the same time and making a decision, takes an incredible amount of effort. These stages map onto how we handle issues in daily life and are a frame for understanding how polarization occurs. And we'll talk about that. But think about it. Most of the time, you just want certainty. You just want to know, so what do I need to do? What's the right answer to this question? What's the best buy for this particular product? I don't need to go into a deeper analysis of all the different permutations of laundry detergent. Just tell me which size is the better deal and let me move on. These stages of thinking, in fact, do underlie theories of moral reasoning. Many of you may have heard of Kohlberg's stages of moral reasoning, for example. All of the stages are built on these stages of cognitive development. And as we'll see, there are entire theories of faith development. We'll consider a couple of those in part 3. So these stages of cognitive development have been used as the building blocks for very important theories, very important ways of understanding the development and advancement of moral reasoning in adults. One thing that we'll continue to come back to that I want to really emphasize here, changing people's minds is very difficult. It only happens when you try to do that by using the principles at the same cognitive level that the person is and within the same logic structure. So for example, if one is dealing with an absolutist thinker, and if you think that you can use data and scientific analysis and deductive logic to change the person's mind, it's not going to work very well because that is not the basis on which those people think. By the same token, if you try to shortcut the analysis needs of the principled thinker, that's going to be very difficult because they're going to insist on looking at the problem from a lot of different points of view before wanting to come to a conclusion. So one has to pitch whatever you're trying to do in terms of changing people's minds at exactly the same level and use exactly the same kinds of reasoning and the same logic in order to have a shot at changing someone's mind. So, as an example of that, I'm going to take a comparison between absolutist thinkers and relativistic thinkers as an example of this is how to sort of get your head around the possibility of changing people's minds, but also to understand how it is that impasse and polarization can happen. If we understand the basic structures and the stages of adult cognitive development, we have a much richer understanding of how polarization happens and how we come to impasse over particular issues. So, absolutist thinkers, just as a reminder, absolutist thinking is built on very tight logic that provides answers to every question that never wander outside that person's logic or worldview. It's completely internally consistent from their perspective. It's a closed system. There is no question that cannot be answered. There is no such thing as ambiguity or something that we would call, hey, it's just a mystery. Doesn't happen. Absolutist thinkers will use complicated mental gymnastics to stay within those boundaries. Think about it. Think back in church history to when when the belief was that the earth was the center of the universe and everything revolved around it. And then along come people like Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo saying, nope, I don't think so. It's the sun in the solar system and the earth revolves around it. Scientists went to all kinds of sometimes bizarre, but complicated systems that they built to keep that belief that the earth was at the center. You can see the same thing at the beginning of the move toward the theory of relativity. Go back into physics. There are all kinds of very complicated systems and workarounds and fudge factors that people brought in to try to prove that their view was correct. So it's not that they use just the simple analysis. Absolutist thinkers will create some very complicated workarounds to make sure that their logic structure is not disrupted. And finally, absolutist thinkers will reconsider a position if and only if A, contrary evidence is presented within the logic system that they hold, and it results in a different outcome. Or B, the mental gymnastics forces an acknowledgement of doubt. In other words, the mental gymnastics collapses. In science, it's often B. The mental and then it's pointed out that the logic is just not working. So it usually comes to be that the mental gymnastics, the workarounds are so complicated and so out of reality that you finally have to admit that the logic doesn't hold anymore. That is incredibly difficult. But in order to do that, you've got to move over. When Einstein and others were trying to convince people that it was the laws of relativity that were true and that Newtonian mechanics didn't hold all the time, it was a special case, they had to get inside and show how Newtonian physics fell apart. It wasn't that they just argued, hey, our equations are better. No, they had to show why the Newtonian equations collapsed. So it was within the logic structure. If you're going to do that with relativistic thinkers, remember that thinking is built on seeing many possibilities, all of which are equally valid. All positions are equally true. Relativistic thinkers generate many possibilities and have a hard time prioritizing. This can result in what's sometimes called analysis paralysis. You keep seeing more and more and more and more facets. And a view that nothing is truly knowable. So what's the point? Why even ask the question, what is ultimate truth? It's almost nihilistic in that sense. And many relativistic thinkers actually will conclude, since nothing is ultimately knowable, I'm not even going to try. So relativistic thinkers will reconsider if and only if they can be shown that some possibilities actually are not possible or practical, because logical argument alone is insufficient because you can always look at it from a different perspective. Just because the logic over here doesn't work doesn't mean the logic over there won't. Or that a higher order principle subsumes all of them and actually creates a more elegant solution. So if you can come up with an elegant solution that takes in many, many facets in one perspective, that often captures the attention of relativistic thinkers. Here's the thing. In either case, if you only try to use logical reasoning, more often than not, you will end up at an impasse. The polite way of saying it is, we'll agree to disagree, or less polite, polarization. You've got your way of thinking and everything else is alternative facts. I've got mine, everything else is alternative facts. You probably have already figured out that understanding the different ways of thinking in adulthood can help you understand a lot about current social issues and current frustrations that we all experience all the time. Perhaps now you have a little bit more insight into political arguments and everything. And we're going to see in part 3 that these same kinds of impasse and polarization in faith development and in matters of faith can again be understood from these basic stages of cognitive development. So with that, I'd like to shift now and have us consider how we tell our stories, those aspects of ourselves, our personality and psychosocial development, and think about 3 main things. The first is personality traits. You're all familiar with them. Outgoingness, introversion, extroversion, openness to experience, things of that sort. In personality development, we can also talk about stages that are based on what are the core issues that we're trying to grapple with right now. We'll talk about several of those. And finally, we'll consider how we take those 2 things together and create our autobiographies, or what are called personal stories, and how our focus on these things, what we emphasize in our autobiographies, change over time. For traits, it's one of these areas where there's a lot of consistency in the research, and we can sum it up like this. For all the different personality traits, and focusing on the main ones, the trend in adulthood is a decline in extroversion. That is, we become a bit more introverted, introspective over time. We become a bit less open to new experiences. We become a bit less conscientious. We back off a little bit of getting all wrapped up in the details of things. And we have a little bit of an increase in neuroticism. We become a bit more anxious about things. Some of these changes are a result of physiological changes. So for example, as we get older, we get more concerned about our balance, for example. So we become a bit more anxious about falling, which goes to that a bit of an increase in anxiety or some aspects of neuroticism. Things matter a little bit less to us. We don't obsess over as many things, and that's the conscientiousness. Overall, this indicates a narrowing of our focus in reaction to those physiological changes. So our traits sort of parallel the physiological changes and sort of help us understand what happens to us and how we feel about the different changes that occur to us. What we can say in the scientific analysis in adult development and aging is this is a theory called selective optimization with compensation. Let me give you a quick example. If you're a professional musician, one of the things that happens as we get older is we lose some dexterity in our fingers. So music that is really fast, we can't play as fast when we're 70 as we were able to do when we're 25. So an interesting thing happens with professional musicians over the aging process. They change the interpretation of how they play it. So if there's a really fast part of a piece that's coming up, when that player was 25, they would play it and just speed up and play it at full tilt. Interestingly, though, if you listen to recordings over about a 50-year difference, the recordings made when the person is older, right before the fast part of the piece, they'll slow down a little bit and then play as quickly as they're able to now. What that does is it gives you the impression as a listener that the performer is playing it faster than what they really are because the last thing you heard was a bit slower. That's the compensation part. It's pretty cool how we're kind of wired. We just understand how to do these kinds of things. These compensations and optimizations that we do will build into our autobiographies. Interesting enough. So one of the big important theories about how we deal with core issues in our personalities across adulthood is Erik Erikson's theory. And Erikson was the very first person about 100 years ago. He started his work and pulled it all together in the 1950s. He had three sets of issues that he claimed, and there's a lot of evidence to support it, that adults focus on at different times during adulthood. The first he called intimacy versus isolation. That is mostly a function of early and established adulthood. And that has to do with the degree to which you're able to form close relationships with somebody else, where intimacy is an emotional intimacy. So it could be a very close friendship. It could be a dating or a marriage relationship, but it doesn't have to be. But the issue in early and established adulthood is, can I do that successfully? The issue that confronts middle-aged folks and the young old is the issue of generativity versus stagnation. Generativity is doing things in service of the next generation. So in your work life, you may do more in terms of training younger employees in the culture of the company or in mentoring them so that they develop the skills for leadership, for example. In your family, it may be the child rearing that you engaged in, and now or eventually grandparenting. And all of us have had the experience of grandparents allowing grandkids to do things that we as children would never be permitted to be done by our parents. That's all part of that intergenerational generativity part. And the last stage that we come to in late life is what's called integrity versus despair. And that's all about pulling together all of the threads of our lives, coming back to those big questions that we laid out in part one, and asking ourselves, so how did we do? What did our life really mean? What legacy are we really leaving? What were the values that we carry? And so Erikson talked about these things and how we shift from one to the other. For our purposes in our talk today, we're going to focus more on generativity, the concern about the next generation, and integrity, coming to resolution about the meaning of your life, becoming whole in all senses of the term, including our ability to build in things that in our lives that are kind of contradictory. There are parts of our lives that we might not be proud of, that we have to own. And maybe we had an opportunity to go back and reconcile or to fix or to change the way we did things. There's another way to look at how we handle these issues in terms of adult development seen as evolving life stories. And Dan McAdams is the person who coined this notion of life story or our autobiography. So he developed a whole theory around how we shift in the telling about ourselves. So in McAdams's theory, a life story is our internalized narrative. It has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has what we anticipate the ending will be. So you can actually ask a person to, for example, write their obituary and project out how old are you going to be, what are you going to accomplish between now and then, what are the key things that people are going to remember you for, and so on. So it's like a story arc. It does, in fact, have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has a temporary end in terms of where you are now, but we can in fact think about our future self and build that into our current narrative. McAdams would argue that by thinking about an anticipated ending, that has an influence on the choices that we make now. Because if we want to make sure, or stack the deck, as it were, in favor of reaching that anticipated ending, we need to do certain things and make certain decisions now in order to stay on that path. And that makes a big difference. McAdams also talked about our changing personal identity based on the issues that we consider important, our values that we have right now, and the main motivations that we have. So McAdams argues that through certainly middle age, the drivers and the things that really are important to us are intimacy, career, achievement, recognition, power, being told that we're good by other people. And most of these are all things and reinforcements and rewards and stuff coming from outside of us. We can have a lot of interior motivations and tell ourselves we're doing a great job, but it sure matters if we get that recognition or get that certificate from an organization or another person. We define ourselves in terms of what we do, right? So most adults, when you ask, tell me something about yourself, start with what you do for pay. We talk about our job first. We don't necessarily talk about our internal feelings, our internal values, and so on. McAdams then argues that in later life, that all shifts. It moves from these exterior focused things to interior focused things, whether our life purpose was fulfilled, whether we feel that our life had meaning. And only we can answer those questions. Only we can be the judge of whether our life had meaning. Only we can say whether or not the purpose that we set out earlier in adulthood has been fulfilled. So the life story approach connects the shifts in life purpose, or those big issues that Erickson talked about, with these prime points of importance, okay, as pivot points, as inflection points. And keep in mind that McAdams' notion of the life story and these values Also linked to the big questions. What's the purpose of my life? Where am I going? Where am I in my faith journey? And so on. Again, only we can answer those questions. Other people's answers don't get it, don't do it for us. So, how do we tie together the changes in thinking, our cognitive developmental path, with how we feel, the big pivot points in our psychosocial development, our life stories, the big issues that we face? Well, what I'd like to do for this discussion is to pull in some really intriguing ideas from Hannah Arendt, who was a really important 20th century philosopher, because it really does provide an example of how thinking and how we deal with these big life issues and how we tell our story and what we do with that actually do come together to help us navigate adulthood and explain how it is we maybe move from one stage to the other. So, an important distinction that Arendt makes is that between thinking, which she calls the sensory experience in a search for truth, versus knowing, which is what she calls the search for meaning. So, in a sense, thinking has to do with an evaluation of data or information that's coming in for its truthfulness. Okay? Its perhaps objective factualness versus meaning, which is deeper than that, which has to do not only with what's the facts, but how do we interpret it? How do we make it ours? How do we put that in our autobiography, right? What sense do we make of it? In other words, we're making sense out of that evidence and experience and information. So it's a different kind of, that's the blending. So the second main point that Arendt makes. The key to a moral life, according to her, is the ability to hear another's voice. First, actually, that is, you actually have a dialogue with someone else, a mentor, a spiritual director, a counselor, a trusted friend, so on. And eventually, you have that dialogue in your head. So, in a sense, you kind of talk to yourself, but it's you think to yourself, gee, I wonder what my mom would have said here, or would have advised me. I wonder what my spouse or my partner would advise me here. I wonder what my spiritual director would advise me to do in this particular case. But you do it all in your head. When you reach that point, that's what Arendt calls the two-in-one dialogue. Now, that other voice, eventually in your head, could derive or could come from changes that a person notices from their own life story. You could read a journal that you've kept over the years, or it could just come from your experience, or it could come from additional information. But most importantly, think back to those stages of cognitive development. Okay? It involves a bit of relativistic thinking. You have to be able to take at least one other position. If you can only take one, you can't have a two-on-one dialogue. You can't argue from another person's perspective. You can't understand it. So the key to Arendt here is that her two-in-one dialogue, the fundamental basis for moral development, moral reasoning, is the ability to take another person's perspective. Two-in-one dialogue opens the person to nagging and doubt, which is, as we know, the prime motivators that sometimes pry open but open the door to change. Hannah Arendt's idea that this internal discussion, this internal taking of another perspective, of taking another person's position, is the telltale sign of moving to at least relativistic thinking. The inability to have a two-on-one dialogue simply results in the reinforcement of your current thinking pattern and makes it even that much more difficult to change, to understand another's point of view, to understand what it means to walk in another person's shoes. I ask you to put a marker down and remember these points, because we will come back to them in very important ways as we look specifically at what this means in faith development and our ability to understand another's point of view, because that gets into the notion of forgiveness. It gets into the understanding of who is my neighbor. When did I give you drink? When did I give you food? From that famous part of Matthew's gospel. I also want to point out that this notion here of being open to another perspective is also in Zen Buddhism. It's called Shoshin, or it's the beginner's mind. It's emptying your mind of your locked in position to be open to a new way of experiencing, a new way of thinking, a new way of seeing things, a new way of understanding a principle. So this is not something that is unique to Western thinking. It's not unique to Christianity. This notion that one has to be able to open one's mind to alternative ways of looking at things as a fundamental principle cuts across culture and cuts across traditions. So let's pull it all together here. So we started with a bridge from part one in that processing heuristics and biases are powerful mechanisms. We all use them. They are default modes that make it easy for us to think. Changes in our modes of thinking occur. We talked about the three accepted stages, but the highest levels is principled certainty thinkers and times of thinking are not universal, and no one uses them all the time. We tend to take the path of least resistance because we don't have that much energy to sustain over that long a period of time, and our bandwidth in consciousness is extremely narrow. Third, we understood how the way we tell our story reflects how we think about the big life issues. Go back to the big questions. We go from a shift in external sources of reward, attaboys, so on, you're doing great, all of those kinds of external reinforcements, to only we can answer those questions. So here's something to consider before we get to part three. If certainty provides comfort, think back to part one, we cycle back and forth between comfort and discomfort, comfort, discomfort. What does it take to push people to go outside of their heuristics and biases, that path of least resistance, and to the next level or levels of thinking, or the next level of understanding of life's challenges? Hint, nagging and doubt are certainly going to be there, but I'd like you to ponder how exactly that works. And I want you to focus on your own faith journey as the topic, because that's what we're going to be doing in part three. In part three, we will talk exclusively about faith development as the content that derives from our cognitive developmental opportunities and from our personality development. We will look intensely at several different theories of faith development. And we'll explore ways to use stages of faith development in our own life, in our own discipleship, in our understanding and reading of scripture, and understanding tradition, and understanding discussions and debates about faith and understanding and mystery. We'll start talking about how we move to a new self-understanding as a result of all of this. And finally, we'll end with the notion of imago Dei, that we are made in the image of God, and how that relates to faith development. So I want to thank you for taking time. If you have any questions about anything in part 2 in particular, but something that you remember from part 1 that you forgot to ask, please don't hesitate to send me an email at my email address here, globaljcc@gmail.com. So until next time, thank you for being here. I hope you think carefully and think in your own life about how you've experienced different ways of thinking, how frustration sometimes comes in, how understanding the changes in cognitive development and the way we tell our stories helps us understand what happens in our daily lives and what happens in society, because these processes are going on in everyone. So thank you. Take care.